the Marshall Court would last for over 30 years through several different presidencies. He would be the Chief Justice under Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. And during this time period, the questions of the powers of the Constitution, of the purposes of government that we had instilled in our foundation, were going to be put to test. Now, John Adams had reached the point where he had lost the election of 1800. And being a leader in the Federalist Party, he did not want to see the Federalists lose so much power that two of the branches in our government would be nearly controlled by the Democratic Republicans. So he set forth to place the Federalists in a position of power within the judiciary branch. Now, in order to do this, he would have to use the powers that the Constitution gave him. So just like George Washington, he established a Judiciary Act. This would allow him to appoint judges. Of course, then he could choose the judges he would want to appoint. Now, of course, that question does put forth, what political party will he actually choose his appointees from? And it is likely that they will be the same political parties as he would belong to and be a leader of. That party was the Federalists. So nearly all the way to the point of the end of his term, when Thomas Jefferson was ready to take over after winning the election of 1800, John Adams places these appointments into the judiciary court system scattered throughout our country. And they become known as the Midnight Judges because it seemingly took place just before Thomas Jefferson was going to come in. Now, when Thomas Jefferson came in as president, it would be his job to have his Secretary of State, James Madison, send out these appointments. But James Madison, also a Democratic Republican, was determined to not allow the Federalists to have this control. And he convinced Thomas Jefferson that not all of these appointments should be sent out. Now, some of them would be sent out, like John Marshall, who had been approved in our system of checks and balances by the Senate to become the next Chief Justice. John Marshall was a man who had fought in the Revolutionary War, had become one of our founding fathers by joining the Ratification Convention in Virginia. He had then gone on to William and Mary and studied from the great lawyer or law professor George Wythe. He actually was also a cousin to Thomas Jefferson. But he and his cousin did not get along, especially when it came to politics. So now stood the Democratic Republicans in charge of the executive branch. The legislative branch was going to have more Democratic Republicans than Federalists. And now the judicial branch at its leadership would have a Federalist. John Marshall would then be the man who would be in charge of the Supreme Court. The court whose job it was to determine constitutionality. Well, that was a power that had not been practiced yet. And it would get its first chance in the famous court case Marbury versus Madison. You see, William Marbury was one of those appointments that John Adams had made in the Midnight Judges. He he was also one of those that James Madison was determined not to give the appointment to. And so William Marbury sued the government. He sued James Madison because he believed under the Constitution it was his right to receive that appointment of a judgeship. And this court case from 1803 would reach all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the question does come forward, well, why would a court case like this go all the way to the Supreme Court? Well, as you can see, there was the question of whether or not Marbury was actually entitled to this commission of a judgeship. But there had to be a connection to the Constitution, to those powers the Constitution establishes for our federal government. And it's in Article 3 that John Marshall would look to. It is Article 3 that is about the judicial branch, about its powers. And John Marshall would point out that it is the Supreme Court that has the original jurisdiction, whether that be in a case in which states play a party, or dealing with public ministers and councils. Public referring to those that are issued by the government or have the jobs according to the government. So in this 1803 court case, the powers, or the main power of judicial review was going to be established. Now, John Marshall would determine that that Judiciary Act actually was unconstitutional. And therefore, William Marbury did not actually receive his commission as a judgeship. The judicial review is what John Marshall was doing. As you can see here in this cartoon, the officials, the referees, represent the judicial branch. And their rule book is the U.S. Constitution. Now, as we look down to the rest of the cartoon, we start to see that here the legislative branch seemingly has quite a few powers according to the Constitution, like making new courts or impeaching officials, whereas the executive branch can only check and balance those powers with a limited number. It is the job of the judicial branch to review this, to make sure that both sides, both branches, are playing fairly according to the Constitution. Thus, judicial review has established that it is the Supreme Court's job, the judicial branch's job, to interpret the laws and interpret the actions of the presidential branch, executive, and the legislative branch in accordance with interpreting the U.S. Constitution. This was a power that would level the playing fields for the three branches when it came to checks and balances, being certain that laws could not be made unless the powers allowed it, as given out by the Constitution.